Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us. On behalf of Yes Magazine, the Land Institute, and City Lights, I'm happy to welcome you to today's teach-in, How to Get Off Fossil Fuels Quickly and Fairly. I'm Breanna Draxler, your host, and I'm also the climate editor at Yes Magazine. We are a nonprofit, independent, reader-supported news organization based in Seattle, Washington, where I'm joining you from today. We exist to inspire people to create a more just, sustainable, and compassionate world, and we do this through journalism, specifically by telling stories of what's possible when people come together to solve the greatest challenges of our time. Challenges like transitioning away from fossil fuels, as you'll be hearing more about today. You can sign up for our free email newsletter at yesmagazine.org. Now I'd like to introduce you to the thought leaders you'll be hearing more from today. Stan Cox is a research fellow in Ecosphere Studies at the Land Institute. His most recent book is the inspiration for today's teach-in, The Green New Deal and Beyond, Ending the Climate Emergency While We Still Can, published by City Lights Books in 2020. He joins us from Salina, Kansas. Next up is Aubrey Streit Krug, who directs the Land Institute's Ecosphere Studies program. She is a writer and teacher who studies stories of relationships between humans and plants. She is co-author of The Omaha Language and the Omaha Way. She also joins us from Salina, Kansas. And our third panelist today is Wes Jackson, President Emeritus of the Land Institute. He is the author and editor of numerous books, including Nature as Measure, the selected essays of Wes Jackson, and Consulting the Genius of the Place. His newest work, a book of true stories about people he has known, with digressions, will be published in 2021 by the University Press of Kansas. He joins us from Salina, Kansas as well. And finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's teach-in. Robert Jensen is a contributing editor at Yes Magazine and emeritus professor in the School of Journalism at the University of Texas in Austin. He collaborates with the Land Institute's Ecosphere Studies program, and his books include Plain Radical, Living, Loving, and Learning to Leave the Planet Gracefully. He joins us from Arroyo Seco, New Mexico. So thanks so much to our panelists for being here today, and thanks again to all of you for joining us. With that, I'll hand it over to Robert to get the conversation started.
Thank you, Breanna. Before we get going, I just want to say thanks to all three of the institutions that are part of this. City Lights, Stacy Lewis is behind the scenes making this work. I've read City Lights books and had the honor of publishing with City Lights, an incredible organization for decades now. Yes Magazine, also a really important voice, as well as writing for Yes, I love reading it. And the Land Institute doing some of the, I think, most important work in sustainable agriculture and culture. And so it's a real honor to be here. We're here in part to talk about the work of the Land Institute and Ecosphere Studies, but specifically focused on Stan Cox's most recent book, The Green New Deal and Beyond. And so Stan, I'd like to start with you. And I would propose that the most important word in the title of your book is beyond, that the Green New Deal is a start, but we must go beyond. So maybe you could start us off by, first of all, telling us how you understand the Green New Deal. We know it's a proposal, it's a resolution, it's not yet a fully fleshed out political program yet. But can you tell us what kind of thing it is, in a sense, and then explain why we need to go beyond the Green New Deal?
Right, Bob. The Green New Deal is just a vision at this point. We don't have a lot of detail about it, and it's really two things. There's the New Deal part and the green part. The New Deal part is pretty good with its provisions for job and income guarantees, for economic justice and racial justice, and for indigenous rights and workers' rights. There's nothing to say bad about any of that. The green part of the Green New Deal, in contrast, is inadequate. It's inadequate to the point of even being self defeating. If you look at the joint congressional resolution from last year, which is really what we have on paper so far for the Green New Deal, which is just laying out its goals. It says it calls for the elimination of greenhouse emissions in various sectors of the economy, quote, as much as is technologically feasible. So it doesn't say how to do it or how much is actually going to be eliminated. And taking that approach to say, let's see how far technology and a big industrial initiative can take us in resolving the climate emergency is far from enough. There appears to be an underlying assumption in not only the Green New Deal, but in pretty much all the climate initiatives that have been talked about, that building up wind and solar energy, green infrastructure, this big industrial initiative that they're talking about will be enough working through the market to drive fossil fuels out of the economy. But history, analysis, research show us that that's not the way things work, that new sources of energy in a growing economy simply add to the total energy supply. They don't displace the older sources of energy as long as those are available. So we need what we need then is a direct mechanism to drive fossil fuels out of the economy by a strict deadline. You can choose the deadline you want, whether it's the IPCC or the UN emissions gap report or others, but all of them, to meet any of those, whether we eliminate fossil fuels in 10, 20 or more years, all are going to require a direct mechanism to do it. And that's, so that's what I'm proposing in the Green New Deal, is a direct, secure, statutory elimination of fossil fuels involving a national cap on the number of tons of coal, cubic feet of gas, barrels of oil that can be brought out of the ground and into the economy in a given year, with that cap ratcheting down year by year in equal increments until the deadline, fossil fuels are completely out of the economy. Larry Edwards and I last year wrote up a pretty detailed plan for how that could be done. You can look up cap and adapt is what we call it. You can look that up. That will obviously, if we do that, we'll obviously have fossil fuels out of the economy. But the buildup of alternative energy, there's no way that that is going to occur fast enough with the buildup of the entirely new electric grid, electrification of everything. That is not going to keep up with the pace of the decline in fossil fuels. So we're going to be living with a declining energy supply if we get serious about getting rid of fossil fuels. The fossil fuel industry is probably not going to accept a business model that says that they're putting themselves out of business within 10 years or 20 years. And it probably is going to have to mean the nationalization of the fossil fuel industry. And so imagine then if we have two public cooperatives have People's Carbon for handling the dwindling coal supply, and people's hydrocarbon for the oil and gas supplies. And they not only have to manage those, but either they or an entity like the World War II War Production Board will have to be there to steer energy toward production of essential goods and services and away from wasteful and luxury production. And then with that being done, at least for energy and maybe for other resources and goods, it will require price controls to prevent inflation, and most importantly, consumer rationing of energy and other goods and resources. Because the thing we have to guarantee is fair shares, fair access to the necessities of life for everyone. What you might call sufficiency for all and luxury for none, or overconsumption for none. Now, the thing to stress is that it's not rationing that is the mechanism to get rid of fossil fuels. It's the adaptation along with the more planning of production. It's the adaptation that will be needed if we really are serious about getting fossil fuels out of the economy, the guarantee of fairness. And this will be where the economic justice provisions of the Green New Deal become even more important, because marginalized and frontline communities were already, before the pandemic, were already feeling all the negative impacts of the unchecked economic growth that was going on then. And now they are suffering some of the worst effects of both the pandemic and the chaotic degrowth that we're experiencing now. So in a world where we're getting rid of emissions, the slogan fair shares for all is going to really have to mean for all.
Great, that puts squarely on the table this question of limits. We all know we live in a society that doesn't deal well with the idea of limits, and I think, Stan, what you're suggesting is there is no decent human future if we can't talk about that. But we do live in a society that doesn't like to talk about limits. So we're gonna move to Aubrey now. In the education and outreach program of the Ecosphere Studies program at the Land Institute, you're working to try and think about what a stable, decent human society that can live within limits means. And of course, it's not just passing laws, it's other interactions politically, culturally. So perhaps you could talk a bit about, in the program, what you're doing, and as long as you're at it, maybe explain this term ecosphere that is central to Ecosphere Studies, since that's not always the term people use in these matters.
Sure. Thank you, Bob, and thank you to everybody who's here joining this conversation and listening today. What the Ecosphere Studies program at the Land Institute is investigating is how to learn to co-create just communities and the kind of social and cultural capacity and arrangements and drivers that are necessary to create these stable human futures, especially beginning with work in agriculture. And I think Wes and I will talk more about that as this conversation unfolds. I want to begin, though, by just marking how these biophysical realities that Stan is outlining here, that we're thinking about in terms of ecological limits and planetary boundaries, and the realities of what is needed and the pace of change that's needed in order to make a just transition. That reality really does spark an emotional response for most people to sort of grapple with that, and it brings up big feelings, I think, for me. And I think that recognizing and naming that is important because often in response to this willingness to turn and face reality, we are greeted with an invitation or sometimes a push into thinking that we just need to care more about something, that we're supposed to take this all in and we're just supposed to care a lot more about all of it, and all the feelings come up, and that can make us turn right back around into denial and avoidance. And instead, what I've been working with and thinking about is, rather than caring more about something and just having more and more feelings, instead working with those feelings and recognizing what it would look like, and the importance of what it could be like to do the work of caring for and about things. So rather than just caring more skillfully and doing the work of care. So this care work idea, I think, encompasses physical labor, it encompasses emotional labor and ethical labor. There's some wonderful scholarship on this over the last many decades of how caring for each other and for the more than human world, the places and plants and co-inhabitants of our lives, are really, really important and integral to not only sustaining where we are now and surviving, but also making the work of transition happen. So it's how we stay alive now and how we get to where we want to go. And so care work, you can think about education. Now we think especially about healthcare, about parenting. And this care work is really important to any sort of social movement and change. And feminist economists have written a lot about this. Disability justice scholars have contributed some really important work here. And I would give a special shout out to Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarasina's book, Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice, where she writes about how the work of community and the idea of community isn't just a kind of what she calls a magic unicorn, a kind of answer you can put on anything and it just solves it. We just need community. But instead, community is work. It involves ongoing effort and negotiation and webs of relationship and care. So when I think about the change that needs to happen, I think about our need for social and cultural arrangements that really actually value care work, which is not really valued or recognized in our current economy, especially due to the fact that primarily women and girls or Black and Indigenous people of color are the ones who are performing most care work. And that's really goes underpaid, it goes unseen. So if we were able to begin to figure out how to value care work, which I think exceeds the current economic framework of valuation, we could really figure out how to value care work. That would be part of a radical reorientation toward justice. And it would also be building the kind of social capacity we need to start and sustain change. And then I would just circle back to the question about ecosphere that you asked, Bob, and say that, again, care work is about caring for each other as humans in our communities, but also recognizing that we're part of land communities, and that we care not only for other humans, but the more than human world. So the word ecosphere is a concept that's about naming the kind of mantle of life on Earth, the dynamic mantle of life, the kind of interactions of soil and air and water and all sorts of beings that together are what sustains life and makes life possible on this planet. So recognizing how human lives are embedded in and interdependent on this kind of zone of life, on the ecosphere, on our home planet, on Earth, I think invites us to recognize the good work that is already happening, the care work that's ongoing, and to lean into it, to redistribute it, and to learn through doing this work of care how to co-create more just communities.
Thanks, Aubrey. I really like that distinction between caring about and caring for. That, you can care about something, but the real work of the world is caring for it. And it is work, and that's important. And you're asking that very important question, who does that work? That's great. Both Stan, as I was listening to both Aubrey and Stan, I was reminded that when I first started reading the work of people at the Land Institute, it expanded my consciousness in so many ways, expanded my vision. So we're going to go to Wes now and expand in another way in time. Wes, your work has always taken a kind of long time frame. And Stan has talked about a policy proposal. Aubrey's talked about a shift in the culture. We know that's going to be difficult, not going to happen overnight. And you've written a lot about why these things are so difficult. You've used terms like the carbon imperative. You sometimes define life as the scramble for energy-rich carbon. Can you talk a bit about what you've called the 10,000-year problem, the beginnings of agriculture when human societies started to create surpluses, create hierarchies because of that carbon imperative? Can you talk about why what Stan and Aubrey are talking about can be so difficult sometimes?
Good afternoon, everybody. I wish I could see you all. I feel a lot better talking to folk in the flesh, but there are going to have to be a lot of changes. And I think we're on the early stage of some of those changes right now. Well, I can't help going back half a century or more. And I think probably Herman Daly had the first impact on me. He was the first steady state economist that I ran into. And then, of course, there are the limits to growth people and so on. And when we started the Land Institute in 1976, that was right up there in front for our considerations, and countless times and telling about the need to live within our means, to end economic growth, which we did right from the beginning. I would hear such things as, well, good luck on that one. But I think there's a change now in the tone. And thinking about Stan's policy proposals and, Aubrey's social arrangements that she's working on. And we all know that it's necessary. Both are necessary. And at least my beginning point is to think in terms of deep history and why it is we have not been successful in turning the current corner. So I have what I call two levels of deep history. There's the deep, deep origin of life, and essentially all life forms begin with carbon. We have what I call the 3.45 billion year old carbon imperative. And we see that imperative at work. You can get the petri dishes and have some sugar on the petri dishes and put some bacteria on the petri dishes, and you don't have to do anything from then on. They're going to hit the edge of the petri dish. And we have an economic system that is nothing more than petri dish economics. Every now and then, our economic system sees a little bit of injustice. We make a few arrangements, and so we can, I guess, hit the edge of the petri dish at the same time. So there is that imperative that has to do with our very origins. And so we tend to go after it. So if you're the bacteria in a petri dish or Drosophila flies in a flask, it's just gonna happen. So that's the deep, deep origin. Then there is the deep history. And the saying goes among the folks that study the origin of human as a species, Homo sapiens, that history goes back about 200,000 years. And it was only 10,000 years ago that we started agriculture. So that's about 5% of our total evolutionary history with the big brain. And speaking now as an evolutionary biologist, it's hard to get over the idea that we're hardwired for certain things. But at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, some 10,000 years ago, the greatest group of revolutionaries to ever live, began to give us our crops and livestock. And some, I don't know, 1500 before BC, like 3,500 years ago, why we begin to get the idea of a Garden of Eden, and then we have the Epic of Gilgamesh in the Bronze Age, and all of those, both of those are talking about, essentially, they didn't put it this way, that we're a species out of context. And Bob Jensen and I have been talking about the problem of being a species out of context and thinking about what kind of adjustments. And we, I think Bob said it first, we will never get it right. We're never going to get it right, but we can do it better. And so what we have to struggle with, though, is, and this is the oldest, messiest philosophical problem, and that is the difference between determinism and free will. And there are some things that are just plain deterministic. I mentioned the bacteria on the petri dish. And then there is free will. And I remember as a young professor type, talking to an older professor about that issue. He soon got fed up with me trying to get that. And he finally said, oh, forget it. It's the oldest, messiest question. You're not going to ever be clear on that one. And so what it amounts to is that there's an invisible line between the two. And so what we know is, for instance, that it goes with the grain for us to get highly dense carbon and use it, either for food or building technologies. And it goes against the grain to control our population. You know, the world population in my lifetime is about tripled. And so we've managed to handle the predators, and we've also managed to take care of a lot of the diseases in spite of what we're experiencing right now. So we've at the land have, I believe we got to put a cap on carbon. And it wasn't that many years ago, sitting with people in high places, that when I said we got to have a cap and then rationing, and I heard the same old sentence, good luck on that one. But if we could get that cap, and then we have fewer decisions that we have to make. And well, we'll have easier decisions to make. Now, some will say, but our creativity is the result of not having limits. Good artists don't say that. Creativity, to a large degree, is the consequence of recognizing your limits. Herman Daly used to talk about that too. So in this journey that we're now involved with, one thing I'm pleased about that was very hard to get a conversation going, I would say 30, 40 years ago, is that folks are acknowledging, yes, there was a kind of a fall. We started that journey into agriculture, and we found out ways to get the highly dense carbon along the way. And then we end up with an industrial economy, and we become increasingly a species out of context. Now, the question is, how can we make this adjustment to begin to live within our limits? And it begins with counting on a sufficiency of people rather than a sufficiency of capital. And so Stan's book, I think, is about the most important book that our side has had in a long time. And Aubrey's sensitivity to the concept of care, and the fact that she learned the Omaha language partly because she wanted to know how it was that the original inhabitants of this continent, how it was that they made do. And so we got a winning combination here. And I'll stop there because there's more senile rapture to come later.
Thank you, Wes. That concept of a species out of context is really central to the Land Institute. The recognition that we are now living in arrangements that we did not evolve in, that we aren't evolved for this, and hence that idea that we'll never get it right. As someone who worked for 26 years in a university with 52,000 students, I always thought about that. Education wasn't meant to go forward with 52,000 people together. So that context is important. So let's go back. Stan's book, The Green New Deal and Beyond, published by City Lights.
Speaking of growth, the reason that addressing climate change has been so difficult and for the past 3+ decades, there's a very, very simple reason that has happened, and that's that governments and the private sector, every single time that have been proposals for seriously addressing climate change, they have been rejected or gutted because of the very real worry that they would undercut economic growth and wealth accumulation, and that was, of course, very unacceptable to world leaders and business leaders and so forth. But there's really no effective way to cut emissions down to zero that is not going to affect growth, and that needs to be accepted. The joint congressional resolution on the Green New Deal is silent on the subject of growth, but as it's being conceived, the Green New Deal is nothing if not an economic stimulus plan, and it would. We will really have to be careful in implementing something like that it not exacerbate the problems being caused by growth. Of course, reducing the amount of energy coming into the economy, as I was talking about, will automatically ensure that we're not overproducing, overconsuming, etc. But in the more near term, as we come out the other side of the pandemic, whenever that is, returning to endless growth is going to be the top priority for business and government. And the Green New Deal, some form of it, is already being talked about as a way to stimulate that growth. Growth lies at the root of the very problem that we're trying to solve. And if we say achieve 3% annual GDP growth, which everybody talks about needing, then in 25 years, the economy is double the size it is now. In any hope of either cutting emissions or of generating enough wind and solar electricity to run something like that, but there's just no way that it can be done. Growth will undercut any efforts to get greenhouse emissions under control. The good thing is, I think Americans may finally be willing to consider something like this. You look here in the past couple of months, maybe three-fourths of our population has accepted the fact that when faced with a dire existential emergency like the coronavirus, that people were willing to set growth and set profit making aside and do what has to be done. And I think once people can be convinced that in the long term, the climate emergency is even more dire, that we've experienced what it's like to reduce dramatically our footprint on the earth, and people may be willing again to do it.
Great. I apologize. I was told I have an unstable internet connection. Usually I'm just accused of being unstable myself, so this is new to me. Aubrey, you know, we've been kind of going between the large scale policy and the actions on the ground that matter as well. And maybe you can talk a bit about, again, what the Ecosphere Studies program is doing, the kind of work that's going on. I find the citizen science project especially intriguing, but tell us maybe a bit about what's going on the ground there.
Sure. Thanks, Bob. Glad you're back. I think that I'm often asked about what kind of actions might be productive for people to take, or again, how to make this work feel real or connect with people. And I tend to think about that in sort of two directions. The first is the work of building a path forward, of figuring out what to carry forward. And then the other direction is the figuring out of what you need to leave behind. So I have an example of each of those that might be helpful. So in the work of building a path forward, this is where the Ecosphere Studies program that I work in is very much integrating with the kind of agricultural research to develop a truly sustainable agriculture that's happening at the Land Institute, and that is absolutely fundamental to long-term human sustainability, to be able to feed ourselves for the long term. So the Land Institute's plant breeders and ecologists are working to breed and domesticate new perennial grain, oilseed, and legume crops that will allow communities to feed themselves. And we're thinking about domestication as a form of ongoing mutualistic relationship. So for domestication to succeed, people have to value these plants and crops. They have to be aware of them in the first place, and then they have to come to value them. Maybe that comes through doing care work for these plants. So to advance the kind of cultural drivers that can help move us forward and build a path forward in this long-term transformative work, at the Land Institute, we've started to build civic science communities where everyday people grow these crops in process or crop candidates in their backyards or homes or gardens. And it gives them an opportunity to meet these plants, to care for them, to share their experiences and their knowledge with us, as well as to report scientific data and to sort of participate in a meaningful and practical way in the scientific research together. So building these kinds of communities of learning, I think, is part of what can advance the work, in our case, of an agriculture that can make a path forward for people. And then I think in the looking back, or the what do we leave behind and how do we leave behind, it's been really helpful for me to think not only about what I want to learn, but about what I want to unlearn and why. So I've recently started working with one of my collaborators on a piece about why it might be especially important for white women to do the work of unlearning, unlearning different structures and ways of participating in systems of domination. So, you know, from my own position, I could say that it might be really important for some humans together to realize that what we thought we knew is not working, and then to collectively, and I think skillfully, figure out how to let go of those things. That seems super productive to me. And I think of that work of unlearning as very active. So I think about what artists and writers and many activists and people, especially in Native communities, are working to do right now to advance a kind of collective unlearning of everything the fossil fuel industry has tried to teach us. That feels like a very active letting go and figuring out how we can leave behind rather than stay within those systems that we're trying to move forward. So I think about our work across those dimensions, but I think that framework might be useful or helpful to people as they look in their own lives and communities and places and networks for opportunities to become involved on the ground.
Wes, you talked earlier about deep history and deep history. I'd like to focus you now on something a little more recent, the history within your own lifetime and your own thinking. There's been a theme here about learning, unlearning, moving forward, but also looking to the past. You've been thinking a lot about a future, a low energy future, a non-fossil fuel powered future. And as someone from Kansas, someone who grew up on a farm, you've seen the countryside depopulated in your lifetime. You've seen a culture say to people, you know, all the action is in the cities. If you want to make something of yourself, you go to the city. You've started to talk about the need to repopulate the countryside, to reclaim skills that were once common in a low energy world. Can you talk a bit about your thinking about what the future is really going to look like when Stan's proposal is finally accepted, which of course it will be at some time, and we start moving toward a future that doesn't rely on fossil fuels?
I was talking about a kind of determinism, and we have to be mindful that a lot of determinism is the consequence of circumstance. And I, of course, think that the unsettling of America that Wendell Berry wrote about 40 years ago, we're seeing it come to pass. And what he was talking about was the demise of the small farms, the rural communities, and so on, in which the scale at the community level was a scale that was manageable by something. He didn't say this, but I'll say it, I think a little closer to the kind of scale of, say, a gathering hunting band in the Upper Paleolithic. There's some things that when the context is there, then what's in the meat has a way of coming forth. And we try to take care of these problems with religion and moral codes and the 10 Commandments and so on. But when we're out of context, then there has to be other creations that block some abnormal behavior. I want to tell a quick story. I have a friend who was professor of languages. His name was Lothar Schrader. His wife was Sherry. Lothar was at the University of Georgia, and Sherry went out to take the dog for an exercise. She didn't come back. Lothar went out. They found both Lothar and Sherry the next morning surrounded by a pack of dogs. Both were dead. Now, these dogs were everybody's pet, well-behaved dogs. They dogs that were taken on a walk, but put together in that context of a particular evening, they did something they had never done before, and that is they became pack animals, and when they were found the next morning, they were surrounding their prey and protecting their dead prey. Now, I think we see human behavior A lot of it is perhaps wild, but we also take measures to civilize ourselves, to create a context of propriety, a context that is not destructive. So we can say that it's in the meat, but then what is the context in order to not have it come to expression within the meat? And I think that we are going to have to resettle a lot of the small towns and rural communities, not as a matter of nostalgia, but as a practical necessity, partly because that's who we are. We did not have anything close to the way our population is currently arranged, with all of the good things that we like about it. This is only to say we've got to begin a huge rethinking of what it means to be Homo sapien. And I don't see, I think we are at a pivot point. And we've got to begin a new journey. And I think it's possible, but it starts with something like care and something like putting a cap on carbon and figuring out how it is we are going to be from now on, knowing there'll be a lot of changes. But there is so much that has been gained during this period in which humans have, well, look at the good things that have come. We now know of our origins coming after a big bang. We all know about the cosmos, and we all know that we don't have to count on a male sky god to be our savior. Well, I don't know if we all know that, but some know that. We all know that it's possible to understand Darwinian evolution. And we all know where we come from, what kind of a thing we are. And we're left with the question of what's to become with us. And now that's on the line. So this is an extremely exciting time to be alive. And it's also a very dangerous time. But I think we've got to begin to think at the deep, deep level of who we are, so that we do not become increasingly like those dogs that killed Lothar and Sherry.
Thanks, Wes. You know, as I listen to the three of you talk, I'm reminded of why I was originally so excited learning about the Land Institute. And it's the range of thinking that goes on. And for instance, Stan, who is talking about policy, is also a plant breeder. Stan directed the sorghum breeding program. He has a history in breeding wheat. Aubrey grew up on a Kansas farm. Her graduate work is in English and Great Plains Studies and brings more of the humanities into it. Wes has a background in genetics as well as the working in a nonprofit. It's an incredibly exciting place. And I know some of you who may not know the Land Institute are thinking, wait, Central Kansas excitement? No, yes, it's a very exciting place. And so I hope those who are on this, who aren't familiar with the work at the Land Institute, will take some time to go to the website, sign up on the Facebook and Twitter feed, and start learning about the work going on there. We had an entire another section to take on, and of course we've run out of time. So I just want to summarize where the conversation was going to wrap up, and it comes back to this question of limits. The three people talking today have talked about how to live within limits in a society that has an almost religious commitment to limitlessness, to endless growth, the sort of so-called American dream. is a dream of endless expansion, and we're at the end of that, and we know that. And I think Wes mentioned sometimes people are afraid that with limits, we will no longer be able to imagine exciting futures. And I agree, it's just the opposite. Once you understand the limits you're working within, then all sorts of new things become possible. As Stan is pointing out, new policy proposals, Aubrey's talking about new ways to rebuild our sense of self and community from the bottom up. And always, of course, taking into the account this history. So we're going to wrap up. There was some problems with the chat. Apologies for that. The last thing I want to do, and I know I'm being repetitive, but really emphasize the importance of institutions like City Lights Books and Publishing and Yes Magazine. These are the places where really creative thinking people are trying to advance the way we approach these deep, deep problems. And I'm so grateful for both of those institutions and being able to participate in them. So I'm going to hand it back to Breanna Draxler, who's the climate editor at Yes Magazine, to take us home. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Bob, and thanks to all our panelists for their contributions and thoughts and ideas. It's been really enlightening. Thanks everyone for listening and for your patience. To answer one of the questions being asked, yes, this session is being recorded, and we are going to make that available on the Yes Magazine website. So we'll follow up with more information so that you can listen back in and share the conversation, and also find more ways to keep the conversation moving forward, which I hope we can all do. So thanks again, everyone, for joining for today's event. It's been a real pleasure to have you with us. Again, if you want to hear more from any of these inspiring speakers, they all have books that include a lot of these great ideas, so please check those out. And for more stories on solutions to the challenges of our time, check out yesmagazine.org. So on behalf of City Lights, the Land Institute, and Yes Magazine, thanks for listening and have a great rest of your Saturday.